In 1996, Marvel Comics was dead. The company that gave the world Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Incredible Hulk, and Captain America had collapsed under its own weight. It was more than $700 million in debt. Its stock price had fallen by over 90%, and on December 27, 1996, Marvel officially filed for bankruptcy. Wall Street laughed. Comic fans wept. The headlines were merciless. The mighty house of ideas, the birthplace of modern mythology, had crumbled. And yet, just 2 decades later, Marvel would rise from the ashes to dominate not just comic books, but Hollywood itself, turning into a $30 billion empire that redefined modern cinema and became a cultural phenomenon across the globe. How? How did a bankrupt publisher of colorful paper stories transform into the single, most dominant storytelling force of the 21st century? How did Marvel go from selling comics at newsstands to creating the highest-grossing film franchise in history? And more importantly, what can we, as fans, creators, or even entrepreneurs, learn from the way Marvel turned failure into a framework for unstoppable success? This is the untold story of Marvel's great comeback. A story of broken heroes, risky bets, boardroom wars, and the birth of a universe that changed everything. To understand Marvel's bankruptcy and comeback, we first need to rewind the clock, all the way back to the birth of the Marvel Universe. It's the 1960s. America is in the middle of the Cold War, the space race is heating up, and comic books are no longer just throwaway pulp for kids. DC Comics had struck gold with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman in the late 1930s and 40s. These characters had survived World War II and become cultural icons, inspiring young soldiers and children alike. Marvel, however, was struggling. At that time, it wasn't even called Marvel. It was Timely Comics, a small publisher run by Martin Goodman. Their biggest hit, Captain America, created in 1941 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. The very first issue, famously, showed Cap punching Adolf Hitler in the face months before America entered the war. It was bold, patriotic, and sold nearly 1 million copies. But after the war, interest in superheroes plummeted. By the 1950s, Timely was rebranded as Atlas Comics, trying everything: horror, romance, westerns, just to stay alive. Nothing stuck. The superhero genre was dying. Then, in 1961, everything changed. Martin Goodman asked his editor, a young writer named Stan Lee, to come up with a new superhero team to compete with DC's Justice League. Stan was ready to quit comics altogether. He felt it was a lowbrow medium with no respect. But his wife, Joan, gave him one piece of advice. If you're going to quit anyway, why not write the story you actually want to write? Stan took that advice. He teamed up with legendary artist Jack Kirby, and together they created the Fantastic Four. Unlike the flawless, godlike heroes of DC, these characters had flaws. They bickered. They made mistakes. They were a family first, superhero second. Readers loved it. Suddenly, Marvel had a new formula: heroes with humanity. In the years that followed, Marvel unleashed an explosion of creativity. Spider-Man in 1962, a teenager struggling with responsibility. The Hulk, a metaphor for anger and the monster within. Thor, a literal god living among mortals. The X-Men, outcasts fighting for acceptance. Iron Man, a wealthy playboy haunted by his own weapons. Marvel wasn't just telling superhero stories. It was telling human stories with a mask on. Readers connected. By the late 60s and 70s, Marvel became the voice of a generation. When young people protested the Vietnam War, Marvel reflected that through anti-establishment themes in X-Men and Captain America. When civil rights were being fought for, characters like Black Panther, the first mainstream black superhero in 1966, spoke directly to the changing times. Marvel Comics weren't just entertainment. They were a mirror to society. By the 1980s, Marvel was selling millions of comics a month. They were innovative, edgy, and culturally relevant. Characters like Wolverine, Daredevil, and the Punisher brought darker, grittier stories to readers who had grown up with Spider-Man, but wanted something more mature. And yet, while Marvel was creatively thriving, behind the scenes, the seeds of disaster were being planted. Because comics weren't just stories anymore. They were about to become investments. By the late 1980s, Marvel was the undisputed king of comic books. Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Avengers weren't just popular. They were cultural currency. Kids traded issues on playgrounds. Collectors stashed them away in plastic sleeves, and adults lined up for every new release. But then came the comic book speculator boom, one of the strangest financial bubbles in pop culture history. Here's what happened. Publishers like Marvel and DC realized that collectors weren't just buying comics to read them. They were buying them as investments. People had heard stories about how the first issue of Action Comics, with Superman's debut in 1938, was worth tens of thousands of dollars. By the 90s, some rare comics were fetching six figures at auctions. Suddenly, everyone thought the same thing. If I buy these new comics today, I'll be rich tomorrow. Marvel leaned into it hard. They printed issues with special foil covers, holograms, variant editions. Limited runs weren't actually limited. They printed millions, but marketed them as collectible. People bought boxes, not single issues. In the short term, it worked. Sales skyrocketed. Marvel stock prices soared. By 1993, Marvel was valued at $3 billion. They were selling over 50 million comics a year. Wall Street loved it. But here's the problem with bubbles. They pop. Most of those rare comics weren't rare at all. When collectors realized their holographic Spider-Man #1 was worth the same as a used newspaper, the bottom fell out. Comic book shops closed across the country. Kids stopped buying. Adults lost faith. Within just a couple of years, sales dropped by nearly 70%. And Marvel wasn't ready for it. They had expanded recklessly, buying trading card companies, sticker manufacturers, even toy companies. They thought they were going to be a multimedia empire before they had the foundation. Instead, they were drowning in debt. By December 27, 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. They had lost $460 million and were buried under $700 million in debt. Think about that. The company behind Spider-Man, the Hulk, and Captain America, cultural icons worth billions today, was written off as dead. Wall Street considered them finished. Comic fans were heartbroken. Even employees thought it was over. Marvel stock, which once traded at $35 a share, was now less than $2. And here's the darkest irony. Their characters, their greatest assets, were now being sold off for survival. When Marvel filed bankruptcy, they had to raise cash fast. The only way? Licensing their characters to Hollywood studios. But remember, in the 1990s, superhero movies were a joke. Outside of Christopher Reeve's Superman and Tim Burton's Batman, comic book adaptations were box office poison. Studios didn't see billion-dollar franchises. They saw campy tights and guaranteed flops. So Marvel licensed its crown jewels for pennies on the dollar. Spider-Man, Sony for $7 million. X-Men, Fox for $2.5 million. Fantastic Four, also Fox, dirt cheap. Hulk, Universal. Blade, New Line Cinema. At the time, it looked like desperation because it was Marvel basically pawned off their most valuable assets just to keep the lights on. But here's the twist. These movies actually saved Marvel's reputation. In 1998, Blade shocked Hollywood by becoming a cult hit. In 2000, X-Men proved superhero movies could be serious, grossing nearly $300 million. And in 2002, Spider-Man swung into theaters and blew the doors off the box office. Over $825 million worldwide. Suddenly, Marvel characters weren't cheesy. They were profitable. But there was one big problem. Marvel wasn't making most of that money. The studios were. Marvel only got licensing fees and a tiny slice of the pie. Spider-Man was making Sony rich. The X-Men were building Fox's empire. And Marvel still broke. Something had to change. Out of Marvel's bankruptcy emerged two unlikely figures. Avi Arad and Ike Perlmutter. Arad was an Israeli toy designer who had worked with Marvel through Toy Biz. He believed passionately that Marvel's characters were more than just comics. They were a goldmine of storytelling. Perlmutter, on the other hand, was a ruthless businessman. Known for being frugal to the point of absurdity, he could squeeze value out of anything. Together, they took control of Marvel and focused on survival. They merged Marvel with Toy Biz, which eliminated $700 million in legacy debt. They slashed costs, cut 40% of staff, and shut down unprofitable lines. They weren't trying to grow. They were trying to keep Marvel alive. But Arad had a bigger vision. He believed Marvel needed to stop being just a licensing factory for other studios. If Marvel wanted real money, it needed to make its own movies. This idea was insane. Remember, Marvel was still worth under $300 million. They were broke, in recovery, and Hollywood thought they were a joke. But Arad convinced the board. Licensing was short-term survival. To thrive, Marvel had to bet everything on itself. In 2005, Marvel made the boldest move in Hollywood history. They went to Merrill Lynch, one of the biggest investment banks on Wall Street, and asked for a $525 million loan. The collateral? 10 Marvel characters, including Captain America, Thor, Black Panther, and Iron Man. If Marvel failed to pay the loan back, they would lose those characters forever. Wall Street analysts laughed. They called it financial suicide. After all, Marvel wasn't planning to lead with Spider-Man or the X-Men. Those were tied up with Sony and Fox. Instead, they were betting on B-list heroes most of the world barely cared about. Iron Man, at the time, just a second-tier character with a history of alcoholism. Thor, a Norse god nobody thought could work on screen. Captain America, a flag-waving Boy Scout who hadn't been relevant in decades. And yet, Marvel believed. They hired Kevin Feige, a young producer with a crazy vision, a shared cinematic universe where every film would connect, every story would overlap, and all of it would lead to an epic team-up. It had never been done before. Hollywood didn't believe it was possible. But Feige and Marvel weren't just making movies. They were building a system. In 2008, Marvel released its first self-financed movie, Iron Man. It was a risk on every level. The director, Jon Favreau, was better known for comedies. The lead actor, Robert Downey Jr., was considered uninsurable due to years of drug abuse. And Iron Man himself was not a household name. But when the film hit theaters, everything changed. Iron Man wasn't just a good superhero movie. It was a revolution. Downey Jr.'s charisma, Favreau's grounded direction, and Marvel's strategy combined to create a hit that grossed $585 million worldwide. And then came the kicker, the post-credit scene. Nick Fury appeared, mentioning the Avengers initiative. For the first time in cinema history, audiences were told, these stories connect. It was the birth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. From 2008 onward, Marvel executed its plan with precision. Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Thor, Captain America. Each film wasn't just a standalone. It was a puzzle piece. By the time the Avengers hit in 2012, the hype was unlike anything Hollywood had seen. The payoff? A $1.5 billion box office. Marvel had turned B-list characters into a cultural phenomenon. Disney noticed. In 2009, before the Avengers even hit theaters, they acquired Marvel for $4 billion. At the time, critics thought Disney overpaid. Today, it looks like the greatest media acquisition in history. The MCU didn't just succeed. It redefined cinema. By 2019, Avengers: Endgame became the highest-grossing movie of all time, with $2.8 billion. Marvel had built a content machine where each film boosted merchandise, theme parks, streaming, and brand loyalty. Characters once considered worthless were now billion-dollar icons. Iron Man was a household name. Black Panther became a global cultural milestone. Guardians of the Galaxy, previously unknown to even hardcore fans, were now mainstream superstars. Marvel wasn't just making movies. They were shaping modern mythology. Marvel's comeback wasn't luck. It was a framework. Protect the core assets. Marvel recognized its 5,000 plus characters as gold, even when Wall Street laughed. Survival capital. Licensing deals bought them time. The compounding system. The MCU wasn't just films. It was a network effect, where each success amplified the next. From Bankruptcy in 1996 to a $30+ billion empire by 2025, Marvel proves something powerful. Even when a brand seems finished, with the right vision and the courage to take risks, you can rewrite destiny.